All right, everybody, we've got the Duskmourn Precon Commander deck upgrades, and it's time to get right into it.
There's like 10 to 20 cards that you can take out of any of them and put 10 to 20 better cards in to make them instantly more playable and ready to beat your friends. We're going to go through each individual deck, talk about the strategy of that deck and how it plays out of the box. So check that timeline so you can aim at the exact deck you're looking for.
And then make sure to stick around to the end of the video. We're going to rank all of the decks against each other, and we're going to give you our opinion on which one is best. And if you're just here to watch an upgrade for one of the decks, we appreciate you hanging out. Hit us with a like and subscribe on your way out.
Gigantic thanks to all of our Patreon supporters. Without you, life would be too spooky to live. That's a Duskmourn reference. It would be spooky without our patrons. You get it. Zimone Mystery Unraveler is a 1 blue, 1 green, 2 other 3/3 human wizard with a landfall ability. Says, whenever a land you control enters, manifest dread if this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. So for that, you're going to look at the top 2 cards of your library. You get to pick one of them and put that one face down on the battlefield as a 2/2 creature, and the other one goes into your graveyard. That's very important because that's basically what we're going to be doing with this deck. We're going to be manifesting permanents, creatures hopefully, but at the very least permanents, face down on the battlefield as 2/2 creatures that we can surprise our opponents with and cheat some mana costs via that ability. And we're going to hopefully be putting the lands that we find when we manifest dread into the graveyard so that we can get more value out of those as sort of a crucible of worlds. Play your lands from your graveyard and play multiple lands per turn strategy. I say multiple lands per turn because the rest of Zimone's text says otherwise. You may turn a permanent you control face up. So that reads, whenever a land you control enters, you can turn a permanent you control face up if it's the second time this has happened that turn. And that's huge. If we manifest an enormous creature, something like World Spine Worm face down, and then with a second landfall, Zimone says, yeah, go ahead and turn one face up. That's all we have to do. We're done now. We have a World Spine Worm on the battlefield, and we didn't pay 11 mana for it to get there. We just put it face down and then turned it face up. That's essentially what we're trying to do with this deck. A lot of the upgrades that I've made have been cards that will allow you to play lands from your graveyard, because that's what we want to be dumping in when we manifest dread, or with cards that were already included in the precon, we're going to be turning face down permanents face up. The only other thing you'll see in here is the addition of cards like Oracle of Moldiah so that you can play additional lands on your turns. I've really tried to put the best representation of those as much as makes sense into the deck so that we can get that second trigger. We want to be manifesting enormous things onto the battlefield that we can flip over, and we want to be filling our graveyard up with lands so that we can get some huge value off of our commander. Taking a look at the cards that I cut from this deck, we've got 16 cuts and 16 adds. I took out Disorienting Choice. It says for 4 mana it's a sorcery, so we already are not loving this because it's not a permanent that we can put face down on the battlefield. If we can't cheat to flip our cards face up, we can always just pay the mana cost of that creature, if it's a creature, and turn it face up. So sorceries have to be hugely impactful for us to run them because it's not a creature that we can put face down and then pay its cost to turn face up, or at the very least a permanent, so that when we turn it up with Zimone's ability, we get that on our battlefield. Disorienting Choice says for each opponent, choose up to 1 target artifact or enchantment that player controls. For each permanent chosen this way, its controller may exile it. So we're already into a may territory, which I hate. I'm just not a fan of that. Then if one or more of the chosen permanents are still on the battlefield, you can search your library for that many land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. I understand where they're trying to go with this, but it's just not a place that I want to go. If I need to remove something, I need to remove it, not maybe, and then maybe get a landfall. I want to count on whichever way we're going to lean with that. Aether Gale is fine, but if you need an effect like this, if you need more board wipes than the deck's already built in, just run some sort of full-out board wipe that gets the entire thing done, or is one-sided like Cyclonic Rift. Kefnet the Mindful is going to let you draw cards, return a land, and you can play that land again, but we can do more impactful things. Multani is a huge creature that's great for a land deck in and of itself, but with our second strategy being that manifest thing, we had to carve out a certain amount of room in the deck for that strategy, and so cards like Multani get pushed further down the line, whereas we need that room for a manifest card instead of just a landfall card. Greater Tanuki, it's a fine card. It's a good common to swap out though. It's one of these that can either be a landfall, search up, or a creature late in the game. We want land to be our mana. We don't care about mana rocks. Honestly, for 2 mana, we would rather just cast a spell. That's the kind of instant and sorcery that we would want to run. That's going to go get a land from our library right onto the battlefield so we can trigger our landfall stuff. Gives our stuff trample. This isn't really a card that I'm interested in for these 2 synergies being leaned into. Lands coming out of the graveyard and our manifest stuff. Kian is pretty cool commander, but I think as a lieutenant commander, it's not enough on the strategy that I want to play this in here. Pull this one out, build a deck around it, and get fun and silly with drawing cards and odds and even and keeping up with math. Scab Ruinator is a pretty good recursion card for a deck that's self-milling itself. However, that's not really what we're trying to do. We want specifically lands in here, and this is a nice creature to be like a residual, oops, I milled it, now I can play it. But again, with 2 strategies competing for deck space, I cut this one. Zamon's Hypothesis. This is another half measure boardy wipey card. Typically, I don't like to cut the brand new cards from this, but this is just a card that personally for me, I would never play, I don't think. And so I would chop it for something more impactful, more synergistic. Same thing with Yavimaya Elder. It's a creature that lets you go get a land when it dies, 2 lands when it dies. But they don't come right onto the battlefield. They go to your hand. It's fine. We can do this in other ways. Overwhelming Stampede. That's not really what we're trying to do here. Go wide. I really want to cheat some enormous thing onto the battlefield and take over the game early if possible. Getting +X and trample really for 5 mana isn't where I want to live. Create a token for 3 mana that flashes back. It's nice because if you mill this, you can cast it at least. It's not a wasted card, but instants and sorceries were one of the 2 card types that I was just so hard on when I was editing this deck, simply because they just don't contribute to our overall strategy unless they are specifically like a, hey, go manifest, or hey, go get a land. This doesn't do that, just copies what we already have, and could be good, but just I cut it. Body of Knowledge, if we were drawing more cards, if that's absolutely what we were about, I would put this in here, but in and of itself, it's not a great card draw enabler, and we've got enough stuff happening that hopefully we won't need even more card draw, especially on a 5 mana creature, so I cut it. Predation, like if you want an effect like this to put a bunch of tokens on or wipe a board, make it a permanent for this deck. Really lean into your deck synergies. That's a great just sort of piece of advice that I can give you for any deck build. Lean into your strategies. Yeah, Azuri's Predation, cool card, enormous card, really easy to cast in a landfall deck, but it doesn't really have anything to do with manifest. We've already cut Overwhelming Stampede, so going wide is not really something we're trying to do. And we really want permanence. So we really want big creatures to be our face down stuff that we cheat up, but we really want permanence, so we cut the sorcery. Hydra Omnivore, it's a fun big thing to surprise people with, but I put different fun big things to surprise people with that I think are more impactful, so we cut Hydra Omnivore from the top of it. Let's look at what we did add, the 16 cards that we added. I've been playing 6 a lot in my main landfall deck, which is a Lumra Graveyards lands recursion landfall kind of deck, and 6 has been absolutely insane. Not only can it help you fill up your graveyard, get lands back so that you can stay on curve with your land drops, but it's giving your other permanents, which we run a ton of. I've hit that a ton. Retrace, which is just toss a land and you can cast it from your graveyard. It's enormous. It's been a powerhouse for me. You want to run 6 in a landfall deck that has to do with graveyard. Oracle of Moldiah, I explained to you, additional land on each of your turns. I tried to put as much of that in here as made sense. Oracle of Moldiah for a landfall deck is just insane. Conduit of Worlds is a version of Crucible of Worlds. We want redundancy on these effects, and so we're gonna run this one. Hauntwood Shrieker, this one is from the main set, but paying 2 mana to reveal a face down permanent. If it's a creature, turn it face up, straight up, and on the attack trigger, it's gonna help us manifest Dread. Really love this. If it comes down early, it's helping you manifest. If it comes down late, it's basically a 5 mana turn creatures up, and then for 2 subsequently, you can just do it over and over again. Love that. Landfall card, play lands from your graveyard. It's triggering your landfall abilities in additional time. Green Warden is a must run in a landfall deck. Secret Plans, I need to test this card. I'm hoping that this will be good, like long-term residual card draw value for the deck, and it's a face down creatures card. There's literally no other deck to run this card in Magic the Gathering, and so I was like, okay, well, if it's going to work, it's going to work in this deck. We need to put it in there and at least be sure So we put secret plans in this version. Springheart Nantuko is another card like 6 I've been testing a lot in my landfall deck since Modern Horizons 3 came out. This card's insane. That's all you need to know. Landfall, you're going to get a 1/1, or if it's on a creature as an aura, a non-legendary, by the way, put it on a non-legendary, you pay 2 on the landfall and you can create a token copy of that creature. I'll tell you, any creature that says when it ETBs, go get a land out of your library right onto the battlefield. I put Springheart Nantuko aura'd onto a creature like that quite often, and it gets out of hand so fast, especially if you're running a card like Nissa Resurgent Animist. We're going to make a little jump here just because I was talking about landfall. We'll go back and catch these others. But Nissa Resurgent Animist is a little like Snake, Landfall Snake, Lotus Cobra, that is also in the deck. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add a mana of any color. Those 2 cards are going to allow you to go nearly infinite, if not infinite. Every single time I have an enormous turn with this deck or with a landfall deck, I have Lotus Cobra or Nissa on the battlefield. And so every time I'm searching like tapped lands onto the battlefield, they are giving me mana anyway, because landfall, I'm getting a mana. Run Nissa in here, and if they print any more cards ever that say if a land enters, add a mana, that is just perfect redundancy and you're never going to hate it. You can play lands from your graveyard. This is necessary in this deck. Ixidor, this is another card like Secret Plans where it's like there is no other place to run this, and so if we're playing this deck, we need to at least give it a shot because it's made for this deck, if that makes sense. So it felt weird to leave this out of the upgrade. Uro's nearly necessary in any landfall deck, and Uro in particular is fantastic because if you manifest Uro, when it flips, when a card flips face up, it's not entering the battlefield. You'll see that across this entire deck, there are very few enters the battlefield abilities because you don't enter the battlefield when you flip face up. However, attack triggers, combat damage triggers, because you know where your open lane is going to be before you flip it up if you want to go that route. Those kind of triggers are spectacular in this deck. But if it's a backdoor ETB like Uro, enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escapes, oops, we're not entering the battlefield, Uro gets manifested face down, we can just flip Uro up with our commander's ability. We're ready to attack, gain 3 life, draw a card, put a land onto the battlefield with our 6/6. It's insane. I love this card and I love it even more in this deck. Experiment 12, whenever it or another creature you control is turned face up, put +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to its power. That's enormous. Love this card. This is the kind of card where I was like, we've got to cut pretty solid landfall cards so that we can fit some of the face down cards in here and make sure that the deck is complete. This is Crucible of Worlds on a creature. We talked about Nissa with the landfall out of mana. Aftermath Analyst is a baby version of this. Return all lands from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Also helps you with mill. Tireless Provisioner is as close as you can get to Nissa and Lotus without turning green. Tireless Provisioner, ETB of a land, you're creating a treasure token. That's really good. That's also fantastic. Some combination of these 3, some combination of 1 or 2 of these on the battlefield, you're going to have the ability to really pop off and impress your opponents. We'll put it that way.
Let's talk about Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, at the helm of the Endless Punishment deck. We have our no edits version here. I'm going to talk about the upgrades here in a moment, but we'll talk about how this deck is going to play. Flying Ward, pay 2 life. Whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a 1/1 counter on Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, and draw a card. This is cool. I play a ton of Rakdos, so I'm going to bring my Rakdos knowledge to this one. So I'll be honest, Valgavoth, it's a little bit boring. It's very straightforward. Flying Ward, pay 2 life. Whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a 1/1 counter on Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, and draw a card. You got draw built into this. The commander's going to grow. Kind of reminds me of, you know, a little bit like Mothman, which at each turn it's getting counters, it's growing, it's getting bigger, it's a flyer, it has evasion. It's kind of hard to deal with the ward, pay 2 life. Honestly, it's not that hard to deal with. Paying 2 life in commander so that I can target something that's a very small cost, I'm happy to pay it. For those of you that are interested in the Valgavoth, I am going to go through this little like primer here that I put together, and I'm going to give you upgrades, but make sure to stick around because I'm going to tell you how I would build this deck, and I would switch out this commander with the Lord of Pain, and I have that bundled in here too. So let's quickly go ahead and talk about our artifacts here. You got a Basilisk Collar because we're going to be losing life in this deck. You got Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Filwar Stone, Greaves because we don't want our commander to die, Mind Stone, Signet. Seance Board is a card that is going to get cut. It's just not super impactful in here. It's an interesting card, and I understand they want to put their new cards into commander decks, but this one just doesn't work that well in here. Talisman of Indulgence, Thought Vessel, and Mask of Grizzlebrand. Now the creatures, it's a little bit creature heavy for my liking, but I will say that there are some good ones in here. You have this Parasite. This is a card that's been pretty expensive. It's good that it got reprint. Whenever an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, you may have it deal 1 damage to that player. This is cool. If you are doing like a lot of wheel effects, if you were to build this super sweaty, you would have Wheel of Fortune in here so that you can really get the most out of cards like this. Blood Artist because Blood Artist. Blood Seeker is good as well. Harsh Mentor works in here. Do keep in mind that Valgavoth, as long as the opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, you're putting a 1/1 counter on it. So that's the entire synergy of this deck. All of these creatures are doing stuff like this. Stormfist Crusader. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses a life. Harsh Mentor is doing this thing where whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact or creature or land on the battlefield, and it isn't a mana ability, it's dealing 2 damage. Just passive things. Mayhem Devil, we're not sacrificing a lot of stuff, so Mayhem, Braids, these honestly get the cut. Morbid Opportunist, this is a fine generic card. We're leaving it in the deck, but if you were to really refine, you could probably cut stuff like this that doesn't necessarily have a lot of synergy, that is just generically good. Players can't gain life. This thing is good. It's dealing 1 damage. You got Star Athlete is putting them in a predicament where they can either keep their permanent or deal 5 damage. Keep their permanent, and if they do, they have to take 5 damage to the face. Vile Smasher's in here, which is like Baby Karavik. We have a new card in here, Barb Flare Gremlin, which is whenever you tap a land for mana, if it is tapped, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. I don't like giving my opponents resources. This gets cut. Falcon Wrath in here. It's good. It works with our synergy, but a 2/2 flyer for 4 is just kind of low beans. Fate Unraveler is fine. It works in here. Carder is a new card that's interesting. It works in here. Mogus, this is a good reprint. Nightshade Harvester is a fine card. It works in here, but it's kind of, I'm kind of low on it. Whenever a land an opponent controls enters, that player loses 1 life. Put a 1/1 counter on it. Yes, it's going to grow. Yeah, the player who's ramping is going to get punished, but I think this card just gets hit with removal. I know that dies removal is old hat, but Nightshade Harvester, it just seems like very low stakes. For a rate of 4, we're getting a 2/2, and I'm just not into it. Rakdos Lord of Riots, just generic card. This is a cut, in my opinion. Solemn Simulacrum is in every deck, but you know what? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Tectonic Giant works for what we're trying to do. I'm reading 3 damage to each opponent. We like that. Brash Taunter is dealing damage. Gray Merchant in here, you know, I think it works in this iteration of the deck. I'm not super high on it in here. Obviously, I like it better in mono black. Massacre Girl is a fine card. Persistent Constrictor is fine. Whenever at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they lose 1 life, you put a 1/1 counter on it. All this stuff is like burning our opponent down. Lord of Pain is so good in this deck. Menace, your opponents can't gain life. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, choose another target player. The Lord of Pain deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to the chosen player. This card is going to deal so much damage, and what's so cool about it is that it says your opponents can't gain life. That doesn't mean that we can't, because we're doing a Punisher kind of group slug thing. We're going to be dealing damage to everybody. Damage is going to get done to us. We're going to need to be able to cast some life gain stuff to get back in the game. Combustible Gear Hulk is in here. Massacre Worm, Karavik the Merciless, the OG. I have this deck and I've had it built for such a long time. Lord of Pain kind of makes Karavik, you know, I like that both of them exist. Let's just say that. Am I higher on Lord of Pain than I am my baby? Yeah, but it's all right. Fear of Burning Alive, 2 red, 4 other for a 4/4 here. Whenever it enters, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, if there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, it deals that amount of damage to target creature that player controls. It's a fine card. I don't like it at a rate of 6. Our enchantments are fine. Spiteful Visions, this works really well with our commander. Theater of Horrors works really well with our commander. We have this new card that also works well with our commander. If a sorcery control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage +2 instead. It's a fine card. Bastion of Remembrance, it's fine. In a massive refinement, this probably gets cut, but in this video, I don't cut this card. In Enchanter's Bane, it's not bad. Red needs to have a way to answer certain things. At the beginning of your end step, target enchantment deals damage equal to its mana value to its controller unless that player sacrifices it. So it puts them in this situation, but if they really like that card, I don't see them getting rid of it. The instance in here, I do like to see destroy target creature in here, Chaos Warp. We do have Bedevil. And then we do have some draw spells, Blood Pact. Suspended Sentence is a new card, 1 black, 3 other. Destroy target creature an opponent controls. That player loses 3 life. Exile Suspended Sentence with 3 time counters on it. Kind of cool. And then we're going to get to do it again. So, interesting card. I think it's pretty sweet. Let me know what you think of this card. Our lands in here, little land heavy. Because up here we have some nice... we have Soul Ring, Signets, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, Rakdos Signet, Talisman of Indulgence, Thought Vessel. I think we have a nice small suite of mana rocks that I actually am going to go ahead and cut 2 of these cards, 2 lands. So the way that I feel about this deck is, like we said, Valgavoth, very straightforward. You want to get it onto the board after you've kind of got a couple of these things out here that are going to help, you know, passively start dealing damage to our opponents. But with our upgrade, what I want to do is I want to bring in more of those effects that are harder to deal with. I do want to keep the theme of this as is. So let's go ahead and talk about the upgrade and what I would cut from this list and then what I would bring in to really help this deck shine. I cut a mountain and I cut a swamp because we already have enough mana rocks that I think coming down from 38 lands to 36 is fine. I've played Rakdos decks that have a similar amount of artifacts, and I've had as few as like 34, 35 lands, so I think 36 is completely fine here. We cut Enchanter's Bane. It's kind of janky. Seance board. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, put a soul counter on Seance board, add X mana of any one color where X is a number of soul counters on it. Spend this mana only to cast instant sorcery and demon spells. It's just kind of medium, and I just don't think it works very well in here. We don't have a ton of instants and a ton of sorceries. I do have a deck that I want to play this in. This is just not it. I don't like giving card advantage to our opponents, so I did cut Stormfist Crusader. Just because at my upkeep, each player draws a card and loses a life. Yes, it works with our commander. I get it, but the card advantage, we don't care. And when you see what we brought in instead, you're going to see that this just doesn't really matter. Braid's Arisen Nightmare. It's a fine card. I understand its inclusion, but it's just kind of medium to me. I don't think that this is really the theme of the deck. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. It's a neat little draw engine. If we had a lot of stuff to be sacrificing, and if we were happy to be sacrificing stuff all the time, I think this card could do better, but not that great. And because we aren't really in a sacrifice theme, that's why Mayhem Devil also got the cut. Whenever a player sacks a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to that player. I get that people are going to be sacrificing treasure, but I don't want to just like have all of my stock in this card just based on hopium, being like, I hope my opponents play the right thing. I would rather have built my deck that way. Falconwrath Noble, which I already said, it's kind of small beans, so we ended up cutting it. Rakdos Lord of Riots, fine card, generic, but also kind of a bummer, and kind of just generic, and just it's a fine card, whatever. Fear of Burning Alive, because I don't like it at a rate of 6, even though it does say 4 damage to each opponent. It's not bad, but we replaced it. And then Decree of Pain, 2 black and 6 other for destroy all creatures. This card has always been a trap to me. It's too high costed Yes, you can cycle it. When you do draw a card, you're going to get to give stuff -2/-2. It's fine, but Decree of Pain is always an easy cut for me. Let's talk about what we brought in. Exsanguinate, because it's never bad to just have one of these cards to help close out the game. I didn't bring in Torment of Hailfire, but I did bring in Exsanguinate just because it's generically good and it's a great way to finish off the game. If you're playing like a Punisher kind of group slug thing, this more often than not will be the nail in the coffin for your opponents if you get them into the kill range. In the spirit of our commander, Roiling Vortex is a card that at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to them. And whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. This is pretty sweet for people that want to cast zero cost stuff and free spells. Just like works really well for our theme as well. We could pay a red and opponents can't gain life this turn. This is pretty sweet. It works really well with Valgaroth or Valgavoth. And Sulfuric Vortex is doing the same thing. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 2 damage to that player. Now, the thing that you might not like about this, if a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. Most of this stuff that's been turning off life gain is mostly for opponents. This card doesn't do that, but I do like what this card does. Just that passive damage. This can be a deck where when you're trying to close out the night and everybody wants to do one more game and there's only an hour left, Sulfuric Vortex is the kind of card you want to have in your deck. Another card that is also in the same theme, Underworld Dreams. Whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to that player. We're turning on our commander's ability. We're making sure to continue growing the commander. And we know that some people really like to draw cards. Well, Underworld Dreams is going to hurt them nicely. Mana Barbs is also working in this theme. Each time any land is tapped for mana, Mana Barbs deals 1 damage to that land's controller. It's a stacks kind of thing. We're not denying any resources, but we are punishing you when you use your resources. That's kind of the spirit of Punisher and Group Slug. So Mana Barbs. I also brought in a Swiftfoot Boots because, like we said, our commander doesn't want to die. There is a copy of Lightning Greaves in here, but I do like having a little bit of redundancy. Bring in the Swiftfoot Boots. We like this. Terminate because I like removal, so we brought our removal up a bit. Ravenous Chupacabra, same kind of thing. It's a body that comes, it blocks nicely, and it also kills something upon entering. A new card that I'm extremely hyped on, Giggling Skitterspike. This is a card that I'm going to be putting in my Imskir deck list, and you can find that also on Moxfield. But Giggling Skitterspike is a really fun card, and it says when it attacks, blocks, or becomes the target of a spell, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. You play it as a 1/1 for 4. It's indestructible, and you can make it monstrous for 5, which makes it a 6/6, which means as soon as this thing is freaking attacking, blocking, or becoming the target of a spell, it's dealing a lot of damage to people. Love this card. And then Sulfum, this is just a card that's really shined in recent memory. It is a damage doubler, and it also is a wonderful blocker. It's extremely pesky once you get it online and make it indestructible. Chandra's Ignition, because one-sided board wipes are cool. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. It is going to hurt your creatures, but clearing the board, hurting opponents, this is a good way to close out the game. And if you're looking for something a little bit more fun, I did build Lord of Pain. It's just kind of a refinement on the upgrade that you just saw. The Lord of Pain, Menace. Your opponents can't gain life. Your opponents can't gain life. Whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, choose another target player. The Lord of Pain deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to the chosen player. This is like Karavik. It's like Vile Smasher. I think that this card is awesome. Let's go ahead and talk about all of the cuts really quick, and then we'll go over all of the cards that were added. So in the sideboard, very similar to what we just talked about, we cut a Mountain of Swamp, we cut Enchanter's Bane, we cut Seance Board, Stormfist, Braids, and then a new cut, Gleeful Arsonist. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, Gleeful Arsonist deals damage equal its power to that player. It's okay. It's okay. We're not in a sacrifice theme, so Mayhem Devil like we just talked about, Barb Flare Gremlin like we talked about, or wait, I don't think this was in our cut. First strike, haste, 3/2. Whenever a player taps a land for mana. Oh yeah, that's right. We don't want to give our opponents a mana flare kind of thing. Falcon Wrath Noble because it's medium. Nightshade Harvester we talked about. This is medium. I cut this because I wanted to bring in some different stuff. Rakdos, same thing. We cut the commander from the deck, Valgavoth, just because it's generic. Like I said, it's a little bit boring to me. We also cut Gary. We also cut Sir Conrad. We cut the Fear of Burning Alive and then Decree of Pain, like you already know. So 17 cards ended up changing to make the Lord of Pain a thing, and let's go ahead and talk about the upgrades here. Scheming Symmetry. This is a card that's a nice political, cheap-ish tutor. It's a $6 card, and I think having a tutor in this deck at a reasonable price is fine. Exsanguinate as well. Roiling Vortex is in here, like we talked about. Swiftfoot Boots, Terminate. Mithril Coat, because the Lord of Pain does not want to die. Sulfuric Vortex, Damnation, because I would absolutely bring in a straight up board wipe like this. Furnace of Wrath, we want to double the damage that the Lord of Pain is doing, so I would bring in Furnace of Wrath. Giggling Skitter Spike stays in here. Mana Barb stays in here. Mana Barbs with Furnace of Wrath, this becomes Degenerate. Ravenous Chupacabra is in here, like we talked about. Sulfum is in here. Chandra's Ignition. And then we have Fiery Emancipation, which says if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it's dealing triple. So if the Lord of Pain is going to be hitting somebody for 4, why not have them hit somebody for 12? If somebody casts something big and splashy for 8, well, we want to be hitting them for 24. Noxious Gearhulk as well is in here. I just like having something that I can bring out that's going to gain me some life, that I can destroy something as well. Cards that 2 for 1 are attractive to me. City on Fire as well, because we do have some creatures in here. I think we could convoke this out. This is a fun casual card that says if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage instead. So we have cards that make our damage triple. We have damage doublers in here. We have annoying stuff like Mana Barbs. I do want to talk really quick about the considering, and these cards can be taken into account for all of these, whether it's Lord of Pain or whether it's Valgavoth as well. Forsaken Wastes, this card is pretty expensive. I do think that this card was recently signal boosted on Command Zone, taking it to around $18, but it does work well with Valgavoth, and I also like it with the Lord of Pain. Vampiric Tutor, because I like tutors. I think having a couple tutors that can get us out of a pinch is okay. Tybalt's Trickery is interesting. You know, counter target spell in red, and then we're doing shenanigans. It's very chaotic. It's not ideal, but it's on here because sometimes you need a counter spell in your pod. Chandra Awaken Inferno, because that +2, each opponent gets an emblem with, at the beginning of your upkeep, this emblem deals 1 damage to you. Some people are kind of low on Planeswalkers. I am not the biggest fan of them, but I do think that this one kind of works well in either iteration, Valgavoth or Lord of Pain. Gamble, if you want to have a cheaper tutor that is totally in the theme of red. I do like this card. Demonic Tutor as well. If you are somebody who's been collecting for a while, you probably have this card. I don't think there's anything wrong with running a Demonic Tutor just to take care of business. I also like Disrupt Decorum as well, which is, you know, an interesting card that just gets you out. It's kind of like, in my opinion, almost like a pseudo Teferi's Protection in red, just because it's like, sure, you could still be fucked with, but all of the creatures have to swing and they have to swing elsewhere. And we're okay with that. I'm sure I'm going to get roasted and absolutely eaten alive in the comments for saying it's like a pseudo Teferi's Protection. A commander game hits that critical moment, that critical mass of like shit's about to hit the fan. Having something that is going to make you safe for 3 opponents' turns as we get back to us, very attractive at 4 mana. Underworld Dreams was cut from this iteration just because we don't really need that in here. So that was like one of the cards that was in the Valgavoth upgrade that did get cut for this. Yeah, I wanted to build the Lord of Pain because if I was building this, I would just cut Valgavoth, I'd put this at the helm, I'd make these few changes that I talked about. You could see this whole deck all in is $198 and 43 cents, and I'm sure that, you know, a lot of that has to do with the reprint equity that just comes within the deck that you're buying for 45 bucks. We didn't talk a lot about reprint equity. We didn't talk a lot about, you know, value of the deck right out the gate, but there are some really good reprints in here. And I think for a minimal amount of money, you can upgrade this and have just a ton of fun and a deck that's going to play quickly and burn your opponents down. And like I said, I've been playing Rakdos for a long time, and it's a really, really fun archetype.
Aminatou Veil Piercer is 1 black, 1 blue, 1 white, and 1 other for a 2/4 human wizard. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, Surveil 2. We're going to get to look at the top 2 cards of our library. One's going to go into our graveyard, one goes back on top. Each enchantment card in our hand has Miracle, and its Miracle cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 4 generic mana. That means you can cast a card for its Miracle cost when you draw it if it's the first card you drew this turn. Little bit of a strange wording here, kind of an advanced commander, maybe for a beginner. It does say each enchantment card in your hand has Miracle, but Miracle only applies to the first card you drew that turn. And so it's just the way that they had to word it to basically achieve this effect, which is apply Miracle passively to the first enchantment that you draw if it's the first enchantment that you draw, card that you draw that turn. So Aminatou wants you to be knowing what's on the top of your library and drawing big enchantments or just impactful enchantments so that we can cast them for a reduced cost. And notice that in Magic now, there are enough enchantment creatures in addition to enchantments that we can look at 2 main permanent types to try and make enchantments as much as possible so that we can get Aminatou's cost reduction going and really fill up our board fast. With the way the deck is built, you can tell enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Enchantment spells you cast 1 less to cast. That's what this deck wants to be doing, is casting enchantments. We want to see enchantments enter the battlefield so that we get residual effects. Soaring Lightbringer gives our enchantment creatures flying. Metamorphosis Fanatic has Miracle built in, and when it enters, you return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. With that Surveil on our commander, we're putting things in our graveyard, we're leaving things on top. We can put creatures in our graveyard if we need to so that we can then reanimate them. We've also got enchantment creatures like Fear of Sleep Paralysis. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield, tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. So you can see what we're trying to do. We've obviously got some Miracle synergies built in here that we can lean on. We've got some top deck manipulation. That's where most of your card draw needs to live with this deck, is top of deck manipulation. Maybe even like Otherworldly Gaze where it's just top of deck manipulation. Past that, we want enchantments. We've got 20 in the deck with our upgraded version. We've got some from past sets that are enormous. We've also got some of our new cards like The Room, Secret Arcade, and Dusty Parlor. Non-land permanents you control and permanent spells you control are enchantments in addition to their types. You can see how that will be synergistic with our entire strategy. And then whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to that spell's mana cost on up to 1 target creature. Crazy, just very strong, and that's where we want to lean. Looking at our cuts and our additions to Aminatou's deck, we cut Verge Rangers. This is just that sort of like generic white card that they put in all the precons, I feel like, that goes and helps with lands a little bit. It is an Esper deck, but look, just run some mana rocks. This creature past helping us with mana doesn't play into our synergy at all, and so I don't like using a spot like that, and so I cut it. Aminatou's Augury, very synergistic with the flavor of the deck. It's got a giant effect for a giant amount of mana, and that's kind of the problem for me with this spell, is that it is a big cost spell, and that's dope, but we're already being encouraged to run big cost spells in another direction, enchantments, and so I don't want to also muddy the waters and have this 8 mana spell at sorcery that if all of my backup plans for cheating stuff out have failed, I gotta rely on just mana. Ugh, I don't want to do that. It is dope, but I'd cut it for those reasons. Burnished Heart, I cut from every precon. Ink Shield, this one is a very cool card that I think you should take out and put in a different deck. We're running things like Ghostly Prison. We're running things that are propaganda, stopping us from being attacked, keeping us in an enchantment bubble pillow fort, if you will. That's what we want. We cut Ink Shield for another enchantment that keeps us protected or keeps us from being attacked. That's where I would prefer to run our cards and make our choices rather than a very good fog. It's one of the best fogs. It's a fantastic card. That's the reasons I cut it. Monologue Tax, it's a fine enchantment, but I don't think it performs often enough, at least not for me, so I chopped it. Spirit Sister's Call is a cool reanimation enchantment. However, it just sort of puts on this loop that we're removing things from the board and returning things, but the returning things have to go away permanently if they... And so I have never really liked this card. I've cut it from quite a few decks. I play a lot of Reanimator, and so Spirit Sister's Call always felt wonky for me, and I didn't like it. Counter target spell and give them some stuff. It's fine. If you want to run a counter spell in your deck, do it. Just swap this out for counter spell. I know it's 3 colors, and the 1 blue pip with the 1 colorless helps with that kind of thing, but I personally don't like Arcane Denial unless we're going like deep on the counter spells, and so I chopped it. Solemn is an artifact, so it's not with our synergy, and yeah, it helps with land because it's an Esper deck, but there's other ways to do it. Just run rocks. Just run a medallion, right? Reduce all of your color of spells, whichever color you choose, by a certain amount of mana. That's where I'd rather live. Cramped Vents, 6 damage to a creature and you gain some excess life for 4 mana is and then 7 mana to have a spell cast once per turn from our hand. We get to pay life. It's fine, but 7 mana is a ton to invest into this. Even more if you want to use that 1x 6 damage shot at a creature. I chopped this one. I've been probably being a little hasty with this. I need to test the rooms out a little bit more to see if I actually like them. But for me, Access Maze didn't feel quite enough, and so I cut it. Whenever a non-token creature dies, you lose a life and create a token, treasure token. If this said May, I would be totally in on this card. I just don't like how expensive this card is to cast, or the fact that it's going to happen regardless. Prognostic Sphinx has really nothing to do with our deck, except it's a flying threat that can scry. So it can help us mess with the top of our deck, but we can do that in way better ways than a 3/5, so we're not interested. Commander Sphere is a mana rock that I always chop. It's fine. It's 3 mana and then sack it to draw a card. You can leave this in if you want to, but if there's a card in the ads, like you want to put the Commander Sphere in there instead, that's fine. And you can do that with any of these cards, but I cut the Sphere because it's just not where I want to live on 3 mana. I want to be doing something towards our synergies by then, not ramping even more. Ancient Cellar Spawn is a dope card, but Demons, Horrors, Nightmares not super consistent for us. At least that's not what we're building the whole thing around, and so I've already kind of got a distaste for this card if we're not leaning into that. However, if we were casting more stuff for free, whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast it was less than its mana value, target opponent loses life equal to the difference. That's really dope, but I wish that there was more of that. We get to reduce it by 4, and so this thing for 3 mana, when you do your trick with your commander, you get 4 damage to throw around to only a player, not even any target. Really sick card. I just want it to be in a deck where that's going to happen more consistently, and so for me it's a chop. Dream Eater at 6 mana, Surveil 4, synergistic, we can see, and then it bounces a thing. It's just a lot. We've got high mana value stuff that we have to commit to in this deck, and so when I'm looking for chops, an easy chop is a 6 mana creature that's not even an enchantment, so it doesn't count toward any of our synergies. Brainstone is just a brainstorm, but on an artifact, and so I'm good. Look at the top 5 at sorcery speed, 1 to your hand, rest on the top in any order. You can see why these kinds of things are in here, but we've got instant speed versions of this already in the deck. So sorcery speed to just get 1, not really what I want to do. Same thing here. Draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep is the end of it, but look at the top 3 of target player's library, put them back, and you can have that player shuffle. It's, again, you can understand why this is here, but we have better ways of doing this, and so I just cut down on that. The cards I added. Archon of Sun's Grace is going to put 2/2 flyer in the air every time an enchantment enters the battlefield, and it's going to have lifelink. This card can get out of hand. Ghostly Dancers is from the new set, right alongside the precons that are releasing. You're going to recognize it similar to Archon of Sun's Grace. Whenever enchantment you control enters, create a 3/1 white spirit creature token with flying, and when it itself enters, you get to return an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. Or if you have a room, you get to unlock a door. That's pretty sweet. I like Ghostly Dancers a lot. Now, Netherese Puzzle Ward. This is going to be one of the more unique cards probably to my build. I think this is really strong for a 4-mana enchantment, so we are synergistic there. We can potentially play this for just 1 mana because it's going to reduce all 3 of that down. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to roll a d4 and scry X, where X is the result. So we get to do a little more scrying before our surveil as well, so it's affecting the top of our deck. And whenever you roll a die's highest natural result, draw a card. So you're rolling a d4. You got 25% chance of rolling a 4. I kind of like an enchantment that's going to let us manipulate the top of our deck according to whatever the d4 rolls. And if we roll a 4, 25% of the time, we also get to draw an additional card that turn. That's pretty sweet, and I think it could be a really strong player in this deck. Also really like Victor, Valgavoth's Siniscal from the main set. Whenever an enchantment you control enters and whenever you fully unlock a room. Surveil 2 if it's the first time. Second time, each opponent discards a card. Love that. And third time, you get to put a creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Very clear why this is in here. So loves to be in an enchantment deck, especially in an enchantment deck where we're dumping stuff into our graveyard that can be resurrected after the fact. Grasp of Fate is just fantastic enchantment-based removal. When possible, any of the effects that you need. Manipulate the top of your deck, reanimate stuff, remove stuff, draw cards. Put that on enchantments as much as possible. So all of your synergies lean in toward enchantments. That way, all of your creatures that are like, oh, reduces cost of enchantments. Whenever you cast an enchantment or it enters the battlefield, you get this thing. Everything is triggering everything because you've put all of your effects onto your synergistic lines. That's where I need you to be as a deck builder. Grasp of Fate, fantastic removal on an enchantment. Elspeth Conquers Death, fantastic removal on an enchantment. Last chapter, fantastic reanimation on an enchantment. You can see what we're doing here. Heliod Radiant Dawn. When it enters the battlefield, you get to return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand, which is excelente. And once it transforms, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card your opponents have drawn this turn, but you get to cast spells as though they had flash. Whoo, baby, that is fantastic and can help us reduce some of the costs of our giant pool of major enchantments that are huge mana costs if we don't have a reducer. Propaganda. This is what we want to do for deterring being attacked to protect ourselves. Stack as many of these as we possibly can. Knight of the Doctor is an enchantment saga that destroys all creatures, so it's a board wipe enchantment. You could potentially cast this for 2 white mana if it's your miracle. Love that. And then in the second chapter, you get to return your commander if you leave it in the graveyard from the graveyard to the battlefield with a counter on it, with an ability of your choice. Really like this card in this deck. I think it's super sick. It's really representative of what I was looking for when I was building this deck was effects that we need as much as possible on enchantments. That's where we need them. Ghostly Prison is effectively the exact same thing as Propaganda, just in a different color. Make sure you run all of these effects. You're already running Solitary Confinement in this deck out of the box. Love that. Leave it. Put more effects like that around it. Make yourself really annoying to attack. Imprisoned in the Moon is one of the best removals in Commander, and it happens to be an enchantment. We're putting it in. Enlightened Tutor. Search your library for an enchantment card, put it on top. That sounds good with our deck. Oh, we can go get our most giant omniscience, one with the multiverse crap right on top. Cast it for 4 less with Amanatu. Baby. Inquisitive Glimmer is just more cost reduction, which we love. Cacophony Unleashed, 7 mana, the definition of a fat enchantment and what we want to be running. When it enters, if you cast it, destroy all non-enchantment creatures. That's very good for us. And whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control until end of turn, Cacophony Unleashed becomes a legendary 6/6 Nightmare God creature with Menache and Death Touch. That's still an enchantment, so all of your synergies are triggering still. Cacophony Unleashed is so fun. Having a thing that can turn into a big threat creature with a board wipe happening as well, you just keep the board wiped. Your opponents aren't going to be able to keep you off the board if your creature's always hiding during their turn. Now, you won't be able to block, but you know what it is. You can also try and get some enchantments in at instant speed. Cacophony Unleashed, I love that one. Zur Internal Schemers, another kind of pseudo win con, gives our enchantment creatures Death Touch, Lifelink, Hexproof, but the relevant piece here is non-aura enchantments, which we're not running a ton of auras. We're running some, but not a ton by any means. We can make non-aura enchantments into a creature with base power and toughness equal to its mana value. So Zur Eternal Schemer can kind of help us win the game once we've got a bunch of, 6+ mana cost enchantments on the battlefield, turning those into Death Touch lifelinkers that can't be targeted to remove as creatures. Ooh, baby. Zur's really cool. Entity trackers from the main set, and I really like this card. Enchantment, you control enters, draw a card. Sounds relevant. And then copy enchantment for only 3 mana. If we can cheat one of these enormous enchantments on the battlefield with Aminatou and then copy it for 3, that's just such a good bargain, and I absolutely want this in this deck.
At the helm of Death Toll here, we have Winter, Cynical Opportunist for 1 green, a black, and 2 other. We are getting a legendary creature, Human Warlock, Death Touch. Whenever Winter attacks, mill 3 cards, and it has Delirium. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile any number of cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. If you do, put a permanent card from among them onto the battlefield with a finality counter. Finality counter simply means if something would die that has a finality counter on it, you exile it instead. So yeah, we are here. We have the deck here, basic deck right out the gate without any upgrades, and I did go ahead and tag some cards. These are cards with the dual type, meaning that the card has more than one type. All of these are either artifact creature, you have artifact land, enchantment creature, kindred enchantment, and so on. Dryad Arbor is a big card in this deck. But because our commander cares about Delirium, these cards end up being pretty impactful in the deck, because what this means is that when we go to use Winter's ability, the more cards that we can bundle up with multiple types, the faster we're going to be able to use this. Because in theory, the way this deck should play is we are casting stuff using our mana base like we typically would in a game of Magic. What we're also doing is we are using this big Delirium ability. At my end step, I may exile any number of cards from my graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. Meaning if we exile a Burnished Heart and like a Demolisher spawn, then we're 1 card away, right, from being able to use the ability. Then we're going to be able to return something, and like I said, we're casting things alongside. So what we really want to do in this deck is we want to fill up our graveyard as quickly as possible. Now we do have a suite of nice mana rocks that are, pretty typical. You got your Soul Ring, you've got your Signet, Mind Stone. There is a Whisper Silk Cloak that comes in here. The Whisper Silk Cloak I do think is important for our commander because our commander cares about attacking, right? It says when it attacks, we mill 3 cards. So if we are swinging, it's going to make sense. We want to be able to protect it. And then we do have like payoffs, big cards that are going to get thrown into the graveyard that if we are exiling something from our dual type pile here, if we're like, okay, we're going to get rid of, like something like a Dryad Arbor and a Haywire Might, we're going to want to return something big like an Ishkana or in this main deck, before I show you the upgrade, a giant Adaphage would be something that we might want to return, right? Because when it deals combat damage to a player, we're creating a token that's a copy of it. It's cool, it's cute, it's big, we're getting big payoffs, that kind of thing. There's also fun cards in here like Hornet Queen and there's some stuff that we cut like Moldgraph Monstrosity. I'm going to talk about that stuff in a minute. But there's like some newer stuff in here like Vile Mutilator, which is a new card that just came out, and Ursine Monstrosity is pretty sweet as well. At the beginning of combat on your turn, mill a card and choose an opponent at random. Ursine Monstrosity attacks that player this combat if able, and until end of turn, Ursine Monstrosity gains Indestructible and gets +1/+1 for each card type among cards in your graveyard. So there are 9 types of cards that exist in Magic the Gathering these days. Like stuff like Battle isn't in here, but you might want to include that kind of stuff if you want to turn on Delirium in the biggest way possible. You don't really need that for this deck. The card types that are in here, the most obscure thing that typically isn't in Commander are like Planeswalkers, for example. Those typically don't do very well in Commander, but, in here they kind of work. I'm sure all the Atraxa players are like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Our instants in here, we have like Harrow, and removal is really light. So in our upgrade, we're going to bring in some extra removal. But basically, the way this deck works is we want to fill up the graveyard. And then what we want to do is use Winter's ability so that we can cheat stuff out from the graveyard. So let's talk about some cards that enable that. You have Carrion Grub. When this enters, you mill 4 cards. Moldgraph Millipede. When it enters, mill 3 cards, then put a 1/1 counter on it. You have really basic stuff like Stitcher Supplier in here, which is good. Obsessive Skinner. When this enters, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. This is very light, very mid on this. This card will be cut. And then we do have stuff like Cemetery Tampering, which is filling up the yard. Deadbridge Chant is a big card that, in my opinion, is kind of a meme, but for the sake of this deck, I think it kind of works in here. At a rate of 6 mana, you're still getting a big effect here that's helping you work toward your goal. We have a new card here, Polluted Cistern, that says whenever 1 or more cards are put into your graveyard from your library, each opponent loses 1 life for each card type among those cards. This is kind of cool. And then the other side of the card, when you unlock this door, mill 3 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is an interesting card as well. Our lands are interesting. You can see it says 34, but that's because 4 of them are up here in our pile of dual type. I can actually go ahead and, for a moment here, disable tags just so you can see what the regular land base looks like. 38 lands in the main. I think that's a little high. I would probably cut a land. Then it does come with schemes, but we're not going to jump into that. Pretty straightforward commander here. We're just trying to fill up the yard, like I said. So let's go ahead and take a look at the upgrade and what I would change about the deck. All right, so we've got our upgrade here. Let's go ahead and talk about cuts. So, sideboard. Swamp came out, like I said. We were a little heavy on land in this deck. I don't think we need 38, so we came down to 37. Gnarlwood Dryad came out. Gets for 1, we're getting a death touching 1/1 that gets +2/+2 as long as there are 4 more card types among cards in our graveyard. In Commander, this just is not impactful enough, in my opinion. Inscription of Abundance came out as well. It's a cool card with some nice modes on it, but for me, it did get cut. I brought in a removal in its place. I think this card is fine, but I think that for the way that this deck works, I think that this card is just doesn't provide a lot of synergy. Obsessive Skinner came out as well. I just don't think it's super impactful. When it enters, put a 1/1 counter on target creature at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. If there are 4 more card types among cards in your graveyard, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. Yes, I know that that can trigger at each turn, but for me, it's just very, very medium. And for a 2-drop, I would just rather be playing something else. We did have Suspicious Bookcase. This is fine, but artifact creature, if that's what we're trying to do, what you're going to see is I picked some other artifact creatures that are more impactful. That way we're not eating into our dual types, because it actually really does help this commander, because we're trying to play Delirium Matters as our synergy. So we did need to, if we are going to cut stuff like this that has a dual type, we needed to bring stuff back in that also has 2 or more types. Harrow is a card that's kind of a trap. It's an okay card, but if it gets countered, then you're down a land just as an additional cost to cast the spell. Harrow is one of these cards that reminds me of when I first started playing Magic. I was like, oh man, Harrow is a cool card. This is a great card. This is something that we should play. But Harrow has kind of been, like power crept out. There's other things that you can play in its place. Instant speed is very cool. If this spell resolves, it's a really nice ramp spell that you can do at instant speed, but it's just fine. Into the Pit is a new card, and I decided to cut it just because this deck, even though it does have some token synergy, I don't think there is enough token synergy in order to get the most out of this card. Into the Pit reads 1 black and 2 other. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. We love this effect. You may cast spells from the top of your library by sacking a non-land permanent in addition to paying their other costs. So if we had a lot of treasure, if we were making a crap ton of tokens, that kind of thing, this card matters more to me. And I do think there's a world where this card is extremely good and people are gonna, I mean, I love the art on it. It's so Rakdos. But I do think that, there's a world where this card can really thrive. I just don't think it's in this build of this deck. I do think there's a world where you can go like heavy aristocrats in these colors and then just, go crazy with this card. But in here it just doesn't work. And Carrion Grub is a good card, but for 4 mana, even with the 5 toughness, I just plus X plus over X is the greatest power among creature cards in your graveyard. I get it. There can be something massive in the graveyard that's going to make this like a freaking 8/5 for 4, and it helps with the synergy in the deck. But I think more often than not, because with Winter, you know, just as a reminder, with Winter we're going to be exiling cards. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile any number of cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. So if there's something big in our graveyard, we might want to just exile that and then get it back, to which at that point our Carrion Grub is kind of sad, right? It's like, oh, you're getting rid of this thing. A Moldgraph Millipede, same kind of thing. For a rate of 5 mana, we're getting a 2/2. When it enters, mill 3 cards, then put a 1/1 counter on Moldgraph Millipede for each creature card in your graveyard. That's when it enters, so we're getting that once. It's okay. I think it's a high chance that this card misses, and we're not going to get a lot out of it. This card is cute, it's big, it's funny, but at the same time, pretty medium on it. It's like, it doesn't really have any kind of like evasion either. It does have trample, which is really cool, but it doesn't really protect itself, and it's very expensive. Moldgraph Monstrosity, same thing. It's a trampling 8/8, which is awesome. When it dies, exile it, then return 2 creature cards at random from your graveyard to the battlefield. There could be really boring stuff in there, like Sakura Tribe Elder and just like some medium kind of stuff. So I ended up cutting this, and we're going to talk about the direction that I took the upgrades for this deck. So everything is the same as we talked about previously. We're trying to fill up the graveyard. We have some payoffs. We have our dual type cards. And the direction that I wanted to take these upgrades was, one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to put a combo in here, just because it's really easy to get stuff back from the yard in this deck. We're playing stuff like Reanimate. So Mikaeus and Triskelion. Triskelion works in our deck because it's an artifact creature, which is awesome. We had to cut some dual type cards, so bringing another one in is good. It's the same thing with Canaptix Scarab Swarb as well, also an artifact creature. So, and then Mikaeus and Triskelion, these go infinite together. So if you have one in your hand, and then maybe you exile a couple things from your graveyard, play the other one, and then you're going to be able to say to your opponents, all right, I'm about to go infinite with this by taking Triskelion down to where I can shoot it with itself. It's going to come back with Undying on Mikaeus. And this is just a very basic commander combo. I like having something in the deck that we're not actively searching for. It's like there's a way that we're naturally going to find this. And I don't think having an infinite combo is that big of a deal in a deck. And it's also kind of, you know, it's inexpensive. Mikaeus is a $7 card. Triskelion's a 12-cent card. People see it coming a mile away. If they see you play the Mikaeus and they don't have a Path to Exile or something like that, then they're just dead, right? Oversold Cemetery, because we're going to be filling up the graveyard. We're running big stuff like Deadbridge Chant. A ton of stuff in our deck is milling. We're just milling like crazy. Assassin's Trophy, because other than Putrefy and like a couple other niche cards, the deck is pretty removal light. I wanted to bring in an Assassin's Trophy and an Infernal Grasp just to have some reactive spells. I hate having a deck that doesn't have any reaction. I understand people want to do their thing, but for me, I'm like, let's remove stuff sometimes. That's how we can also win. Lightning Greaves, because our commander does not want to die. We did talk about how Whisper Silk Cloak is in the deck, but Lightning Greaves is such a strong card that I'm like, yes, it can go in a lot of decks. If your commander is doing a thing, when it attacks, it's milling, that's working with our synergy. We don't want it to just die all the time to removal. You know, if we need to get through on somebody who doesn't have good blockers, we can at least swing that way. And Lightning Greaves are going to protect our dude. But yeah, Oversold Cemetery, because we're filling up the graveyard. Ripples of Undeath is a very good new card. Came out of Modern Horizons 3 at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. Mill 3 cards. This is fantastic. After you draw, you're going to mill 3. And then you may pay 1 and 3 life, and if you do, put a card from among those 3 cards into your hand. This card is freaking sweet, man. It's working with our synergy. It is also giving us an opportunity to get something big and impactful back. Like, oops, we freaking milled Micaeus. Okay, well, that's a good thing that we want to pay 1 and 3 life to get back, because we know that's one of our combo pieces. Stitched together as well. In this, it's going to be so easy to make sure that Threshold is online, that we're just going to be able to get something back. This is very much like a budget reanimate, and we're running it in addition to reanimate. Hedge Shredder is in here, new card, also works really well with our synergy. Very easy to crew this with something small on our side of the battlefield, and then we're hacking in with a 5/5 that's also milling, and then we're putting land cards that are put into our graveyard from the library we're putting onto the battlefield tapped. So what's not to like about that? And then obviously we want to talk about Golgari Grave Troll. This is a card that I believe if you are in a synergy like this, like a dredge, like I'm trying to fill up my yard, I oftentimes would go with like Entomb into Golgari Grave Troll, but I think we can very easily get Grave Troll just naturally into the yard. But if you really do like being able to dredge 6 and really get the most out of this kind of like dredge ability, Grave Troll's like the best card that does this. It's extremely cheap because it recently got a reprint. It's been cheap for a while, ever since dredge kind of got nudged out of being a modern viable deck. Grave Troll's kind of like faded into obscurity, but it's extremely good in Commander, and I think it works well in this deck, and I would definitely run Grave Troll. So here are the considering. These are cards that are not in the deck, but if you have, if you're collecting, you might have these in binders, and I do think that they're worth checking out. If you do really like the Grave Troll dredge ability and you're looking for more dredge, you will definitely want to check out Stinkweed Ib just for that dredge 5, and it is a flyer that's gonna destroy stuff if you do decide to just play it. The Chthonian Nightmare, new card as well, 1 black 1 other. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy, and then you can pay X energy, sack a creature, return it to its owner's hand. Return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. This is very pesky and very good for low to the ground creature types that are 3 mana or less. Definitely a card worth messing around with. I've seen people playing this in Commander, and it's honestly pretty busted. Greater Good is one of these cards that's just very good. It is better when you have very high power stuff, but if you're trying to cycle through the deck and get rid of dead cards and just fill up the yard, I think Greater Good works well in here. Entomb, a little bit more of an expensive card, so I put it in the considering, but if you are like, man, I want to get this specific creature in the yard, Entomb is the card for you. I like having a couple tutors as well. Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor. I don't think there's anything wrong with being able to like know definitively I'm gonna go get this card and make sure that I can answer this situation. I think a couple tutors are fine. If you're playing every single tutor that exists, that's when it can get kind of annoying. Constant Mists, because sacrificing a land, we're going to prevent all combat damage the first time, and then we can buy it back if we want to by sacking a land. This is going to help us turn on Threshold. We could pitch a land to the yard, that kind of thing. Or not Threshold, but Delirium. Why not both, right? Constant Mists is one of these cards that I've liked for a long time. It's a little bit more expensive because it hasn't been reprinted in a long time. Valgavas Lair is a card that's interesting as well. It's an enchantment land. So we're hitting 2 permanent types here. So we do have a land here, newer card, might be worth considering. I like this card. I'm excited to see where it goes. I don't have it in the main deck, but it is worth checking out. Then we do have a few sorceries here. Demonic Tutor, I was just talking about some tutor spells. Buried Alive. This is one of those things where you're like, okay, Buried Alive. We're going to go get the Micaeus. We're going to throw it in the graveyard. We're going to get the Golgari Grave Troll because we want to start milling. Buried Alive is a great card that just is a tutor for putting stuff in the yard, and that way you can start getting your synergy going. Victimized, because in a deck like this, we're choosing 2 creature cards in your graveyard and we're sacking a single creature, and if we do, we're returning 2 cards. Victimized is just so freaking good at 3 mana. I have never understood why this card is honestly an uncommon. It's just such a big effect for 3 mana. And then finally, Damnation, worth considering as well. Just having a straight up board wipe in the deck is always good at under 20 bucks. I know it's a little bit expensive, but definitely worth considering Damnation. So now that you've seen all the upgrades, we're going to rank all of these commanders based on the face commander, based on, I guess, which one we think is going to be the most fun.
Yeah.
We're going to start with number 4.
Yeah, strongest, most fun. At number 4, we would put Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls. It has a pretty sweet ability. When an opponent loses the life, we get to draw a card and it grows, and it's a flying threat with a decent ward. It's not a great ward because paying 2 life is really easy in Commander. The thing that we don't really love about Valgavoth as a face commander itself is that besides the ward, which you can't control and the opponent can control totally, there's not really a built-in way to do damage with Valgavoth. And so that's not a deal breaker to make this not a strong commander, but just because it doesn't sort of come as an all-inclusive package, we would rank this one at number 4 out of these 4 commanders.
Yeah, it's very basic. It's, even though the deck has a lot of really good cards in it, which we cover, yeah, the commander's just kind of boring. I could think of so many other Rakdos commanders that I would rather play than this one, which is why we're ranking this in number 4. At number 3, because it's Esper colors and these are scumbag colors, we had to put Amanatu. It's fun. Miracle came to us way back in Avacyn Restored. It's a fun kind of ability. Each enchantment card in your hand has Miracle. Its Miracle cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 4. So if you draw that enchantment this turn, you can cast big beefy enchantments for cheap. I think for players that really like Esper enchantments, this can be a deck that's going to be really popular. It's kind of like the antithesis of what I want to play in a weird way. So that's why for us, it's coming in at number 3.
Yeah, another big reason it's ranked 3rd is the deck encourages you to run high cost enchantment permanents so that if you draw one on that turn, you can cast it for 4 less. If Amanatu is just repeatedly answered, you're going to have a deck without green having you draw consistently 7, 8, and 9 mana permanents, and that freaks me out. Even though Surveil 2 every upkeep of yours is sick, I think it gets ranked down below the other 2 because it is such a reliance on a tough to cast thing in tough to cast thing big colors. At number 2, we put Zimone, Mystery Unraveler. The ability of this ramp commander to cheat big things on even faster than a ramp commander should puts it in a Simic power level that's ridiculous to me. You have to achieve the double landfall, but the Manifest Dread and the amount of graveyard land type deck support that exists on top of, just creatures like a World Spine Worm. No big deal. World Spine Worm goes down face down on whatever turn you're able to activate the trigger, the first ability of Zimone, and then you're just turning it face up if you can get that second land to happen, and a fetch will help you do that, plus 1,000 other cards. So this one is kind of insane to me because they were like, what Simic ramps aren't doing is going fast enough.
Oh yeah, I'm just so excited that Simic finally got a good card here. It's been a while.
Yeah.
And then at number 1, we have a commander here, Winter at the Golgari helm, and it's just because we finally have like a Delirium Matters commander that's pretty cool. At the beginning of your end step, you may exile any number of cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. So we have enchantment creatures, we have artifact creatures, we have all of these things that kind of double up, and then we're able to put permanents from among these cards onto the battlefield. So it's just interesting, it's fun. I do think, it's going to get more players into, exploring graveyard-centric decks. How quickly can I fill up my graveyard and how can I abuse that? And so, pretty cool.
Yeah, as far as strength of commander goes, it's got death touch with a really good toughness, and so it's attacking and blocking really favorably for you. And the attack trigger of milling 3 cards, that's a really strong mill effect. Mill 3 is not an easy thing to achieve, and to have it repeatedly on your commanders, really sick. And then a free reanimation with something that it's also fulfilling. This is kind of like the opposite reasoning of Valgavoth, right? Is Winter has literally everything built in, including a pseudo attacking protection, enough to make it where I'm not like, God, we got to get something on this Winter to get it through. But whereas, Valgavoth doesn't have the ability to fulfill the requirements itself. That's why we like Winter at number 1. I personally think Winter and Zimone, very high power level for what they do. Either way you want to go is going to be a very strong deck experience right out of the box, especially if you make some of the upgrades we suggested.
Yeah, very easy upgrades, whether you want to spend a little bit more or not, can really take a lot of these decks to the next level.
That's right. All the names that you've seen scrolling in between us are our patrons at our $10 level or higher. They support us a little bit more a month, and they get custom Dragon Shields for it. Channel custom Dragon Shield sleeves for free if you join at that level. Go check out our Patreon, see if it's a good fit for you, and thank you for watching this.
Until next time, we hope that your day is the upgrade you've been looking for.